There are more people subject to domestic violence every year, which accumulates to quite a lot over a lifetime. About 5% of people every year experience domestic violence.
Is this something that should be run as a branch of the national health, for example?
Unemployment is one of the biggest triggers of domestic violence. The 21st century police officers should be more omnicompetent.
Over the macro, over the long view, you're actually reducing the rates of domestic violence and actually impacting people's lives.
Hello, and welcome back again to this episode of the Marginal Babble podcast. In today's episode, I sit down to talk with Professor Sid Bandyopadhyay at the University of Birmingham to discuss domestic violence and its impact on the UK's socio-economic environment. Sid co-authored a paper on the effectiveness of battery intervention programmes implemented in the UK, a programme that aims to reduce the recidivism rates on low-risk offenders. As ever, reference research material is included in the description down below, and without further ado, let's get into the episode. Enjoy.
You mentioned in the study that you worked on that 1 in 20 people aged 16 and over have experienced some form of domestic violence and abuse in their lifetime. Why do you believe this is as pervasive as an issue as it is in the UK?
So I don't think it's just UK. I think worldwide, there are more people subject to domestic violence every year, which accumulates to quite a lot over a lifetime. And there are many what you'd call factors which are associated with it. I particularly want to be sort of a little careful with the choice of words here because, even though that's not the intention, when you say this is a reason, people sort of kind of imagine that's a kind of justification. It's
right,
not.
Yeah.
It's just that these factors could be triggers, some more than others. So I think, the UK is not exempt from any of the factors that are associated with domestic violence, and that could be, for example, the economy. Like it or not, unemployment is one of the biggest triggers of domestic violence.
Right, yeah, of course.
So if you look at downturns in the economy, you would see increases in the incidence of domestic violence. There are other things around family circumstances. So both perpetrators and victims who witnessed domestic violence when they were young are more likely to be associated either as perpetrator or victim. And sometimes it's a fine line. There are people who've been victims who've gone on to become perpetrators. That's another thing. Third is mental health issues, anger management issues. Mm-hmm. So I think, all these factors, even though you might think, the UK being a developed country, resources, which is again, lack of resources, another huge trigger, which I worked on actually in low and middle income countries, may not be as much of an issue. Nonetheless, economic conditions, role models of what they've seen in childhood, mental health issues, anger management issues, other causes of stress in their lives. So all these kind of build up. And I think the accumulation is that about 5% of people every year experience domestic violence.
Yeah. And it does seem to be, it's an interesting issue as well, because for a country that I think has resources have become more available for domestic violence victims over the course of the years mm-hmm. as well. That being said, from what I could gather, total domestic violence cases and sexual offences, for example, have also been increasing over that time. So, for example, I think I found that total sexual offences in 2010 throughout the whole year was just over 53,000, but then in 2020 it moved up to 150,000. I'm a little bit curious about that as to why does seem to be a trend towards more domestic violence cases. But what I would also imagine is as the issue becomes more prevalent, as we understand it more, I think maybe more cases are actually being recorded. And so perhaps it's maybe a little disguised in the statistics actually that the problem is not necessarily getting worse, or maybe it is, but perhaps actually we're just getting better at recording them and actually finding out those situations.
Yeah, so essentially it depends on what, separating out the impact of improved reporting, which actually is a good thing, from true increases in incident, but also, so there are two things. One, obviously, as you pointed out, improved reporting. Now, some of that we can control for using surveys. For example, police recorded crime might show an increase, but if you actually look at British Crime Survey and you don't see much of an increase, then you would know that a lot of it is driven by increased reporting. But also for the year that you mentioned, COVID was a factor. I mean, you must have seen that during COVID, there were these news reports around surges in domestic violence and sexual abuse. And I think two people who probably don't like each other, who have issues, being forced to live in close proximity led to a lot of increases in incidents of domestic violence. So I think I wouldn't necessarily say there's therefore a long-term increase in trend.
Right.
I think we have to see how things work out now that things are going back to normal after COVID. So I wouldn't place too much reliance on the increase that you see over the last 2 or 3 years. I hope that's not a trend.
Yeah.
And I hope that's just a fluctuation because of COVID.
Yeah. I think really what that comes down to is, as you quite rightly mentioned, there does seem to be more incidences when there is more stress and strain on individual relationships, whether that be those economic or cultural or what have you.
Exactly.
I mean, you talked about there about how when there's increased poverty rates or there's a downturn and there's a recession, then rates increase. Well, because there's, more economic stresses on households and individuals. And as a result, that leads to it. In that particular scenario, I'd imagine being locked up with someone, the stresses of having a pandemic, health concerns, but also just being locked in a space with someone would lead to increased rates and things in that example.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of also leads to kind of more situations of conflict, and so previously some of that could be managed. I mean, you could go out. There were other options, but being locked down itself has a stress. So I think it can aggravate even all sorts of relationships. Certainly, relationships between people who essentially do not get along, or between people who have anger management issues and who are more prone to believing that they can express their conflict through violence.
Yeah. And so I guess to link this back into sort of the research that you conducted, a big portion of the research that of this study pertains to the influence of C.A.R.A. Could you just talk a little bit about what that is and and how it relates to domestic violence?
Yeah, so C.A.R.A, which is Questioning and Relationship Abuse, so that belongs to a wider class of programs called Batterer Intervention Programs. So it started in the US, where courts began to sort of take active steps to say, well, we need to do something to manage these perpetrators, and that's also done, essentially to make the victim safer and to make sure that you reduce future victimization, either of the same person or a different person.
Yeah.
And they come in wide varieties of forms in terms of duration, in terms of the type of intervention, and the evidence shows that there is some reduction in domestic violence for those who've attended these programs, as in they reoffend less. So C.A.R.A belongs to that. C.A.R.A in particular is a somewhat shorter intervention where essentially there are 2 workshops that the perpetrator attends. Each workshop is about 5 hours. It's spaced over a few weeks apart, where they are kind of made to reflect on their actions and what's triggered them. So that's essentially what C.A.R.A does. And then what we do is we want to see, well, does C.A.R.A actually work, and on what types of perpetrators? That's the essence. Look at a batterer intervention program, look at a specific program, look at whether it works, and second, is it also value for money?
Right, yeah. And so these are quite, I would say low-level intervention maybe isn't necessarily the right word, but it's, like I said, there are workshops that are conducted over either like a 1 or 2 day span of several hours. We're talking hours, not days, in terms of time and influence. Yeah. And they're used on sort of low-risk offenders, that in scenarios where, because you wouldn't necessarily want to use this kind of work on a high-risk offender on the case that they go back and they actually do reoffend quite significantly.
Yeah, so C.A.R.A has mostly been used on low risk and what are classed as medium risk, and by their very nature, these are arbitrary. The line is arbitrary. You have to make a judgment. Who's low risk, and the risk is usually classed as, risk to the victim. So certain police forces have used it for both low, or what they call standard risk, and medium risk. Others have dispensation only to use it for low risk offenders.
Okay, I see. And what were the results? From what I read, it seems to be quite effective.
Yeah, so the punchline is that yes, in the 2 police force areas that we looked at, people who've participated in the C.A.R.A program, their reoffending rate is between 30 to 70% lower than a matched group of people who would have been eligible for C.A.R.A but were not offered C.A.R.A. So that's a fairly significant reduction.
And that's against a control group. That's not.
Yes, exactly.
That's not against. The...
No, that's not against their offending history.
Right,
that's against a control group. Yes.
Right. So, okay. Got you.
Yeah.
And so that's quite a significant reduction then.
It is quite a significant reduction
when you consider it. I guess then the question is, are there any sort of limitations to the research? So, for example, I think you conducted it on 2 specific examples of it being conducted.
Hampshire,
right. So it's not necessary. Would you say that these, let's say if C.A.R.A was to be rolled out across the country and made sort of more uniform and was sort of back behind it, what kind of results would you expect to see? Obviously, you can't predict necessarily the future, but do you think it would be a representative, or do you think that they were very quite isolated cases and that's why they were effective?
I wouldn't think they're isolated. West Midlands and Hampshire are actually pretty different. Hampshire is kind of mostly white, relatively affluent area. West Midlands, much more diverse population, much more diverse also in terms of socio-economic indicators.
Right, of course.
So they haven't been, used on very homogeneous police forces. I would expect, I can't predict what the magnitudes would be, but I would expect if it's used in another area, you will see some reduction in offending compared to a control group.
Yeah. And how are they? So you mentioned these are quite cost-effective programs. Is there any sort of relative bar that we could place against in terms of how quote-unquote cheap these procedures are compared to, let's say, other forms of, incarceration rates and things like that?
Okay. So a couple of things. First, let me tell you, compared to, not doing anything, for example, C.A.R.A versus people who are eligible, what's the sort of, if you can put a pound value to it, and I'm happy to explain how we do it. So for every pound invested in the program, there's a benefit which, if monetized, comes to roughly between 3 and 11 pounds. So, which is pretty significant.
Right, yeah.
Okay. So the 2 questions. One is, how does it compare to other programs? Well, we don't fully know, simply because there are very few cost-benefit analysis of other programs. B, how does it compare to locking them up? Well, clearly locking them was extremely costly. Each prison place costs around, I think it's around 30 to 35,000 pounds per year.
From the data that I looked at before coming here, I think in 2021 to 2022, it's about 47,000 per inmate. So significant, quite significant.
So it's huge, right? Yeah, I'm not surprised with the inflation. Yeah, so I think I quoted a figure from about 4 years ago. So
of course,
I'm not surprised that it's about more than 40, near 50,000. So that's huge. But also, and this is something which a lot of people fail to understand, there's also what you call a criminogenic effect of being locked up. So you're more likely to reoffend, and not just in violence,
absolutely,
but other types, because it's very difficult for you to get a job. And remember, we spoke earlier about the impact of unemployment on violence, but there's also the impact of unemployment on other types of crime. So not only is locking up itself costly per year, you incur these future costs against not a very clear picture of what deterrence there is.
Right.
Right?
Because this is where I think it becomes quite a nuanced discussion in this regard, because for example, like we were able to establish, at least in these settings, that C.A.R.A was able to reduce, reoffending rates by about 30%. Now, I think a lot of people potentially even listening to this would even be like, well, actually, okay, so you've reduced it by 30%. The very fact that you've taken a quote unquote low level risk offender, essentially let them walk free, and actually even some people have reoffended, is actually going to be quite concerning to some people. And so I think some people would say that's quite a concern. I think the problem really lies in kind of what you're talking about there, is not only the cost associated with it, because like I say, it's approximately about £47,000 per inmate. That's a lot of money. That's money that could be pushed into these programs instead. And that could see considerable reductions in rates. Putting someone in prison doesn't necessarily change their behaviour. In fact, I think
that's really important. Yeah,
absolutely right. Putting someone in prison doesn't necessarily make them change their behaviour positively. In fact, I think the research was pretty concluded on this, that when you put people in and around people that are also offenders and also criminals, the likelihood that they will reoffend is much, much higher.
Oh, it's huge. I mean, the statistics from the Ministry of Justice, I think, is fairly conclusive that if you put people in prison, it just increases their reoffending rate. So, I mean, for very obvious reasons. One is you're less likely to get employed. Second, you are with other criminals, so your crime opportunities go up. Third, I mean, if you're with other people, and it almost, I would think it's kind of normal thing to do. You're with other violent people, other offenders. You think, yeah, that's the way life is. And so I think there are loads of reasons to believe that prison is not good for reoffending. I also recognize that prison with appropriate programs that help you get back to work. So there's some evidence from Nordic countries, which, by the way, they don't use prisons much, but when they do, they have the resources to actually bring people back.
They really invest in them, yeah.
Yeah, so prison can work in certain circumstances, but I don't think in the UK we actually have the resources to be able to bring people back to from prison where they can be gainfully employed.
Yeah, and I think that's really what it comes down to and this is why I think, although talking about these kind of subjects in an economic or a monetary manner, I think you do have to be careful with it, because obviously there's a lot of context around it, and in terms of people's feelings and the actual, those domestic violence abuses are very, very real. They're very, very felt by those people, and we have to recognise that. I think that is important. But the reason why I think the monetary and the economics always comes back to it is, absolutely to your point, we can either invest significantly in rehabilitation for the inmates and the prisoners we have. I think we've seen that a lot in Scandinavia, but that costs considerably more money. And as a result, we would be able to hold less prisoners. And so there's almost a balancing act of how much work you want to do in terms of containing inmates, and then also rehabilitating them and the costs associated with that. And for example, in this scenario, what we found is actually quite a low effort, low budget policy that actually affects the person's change.
Yes.
Which I think is important. It removes them from going into the prison system, which then costs us money, which then that money that can be circled back into either prisons for increased rehabilitation, so that the inmates that are serious offenders, again, we're talking in this context of C.A.R.A about low risk reoffenders, right? The ones that do have to go to prison under any circumstances, potentially by taking the low level prisoners out of that, you're freeing up resources to really redevelop them. And so actually over the long view, you're actually reducing the rates of domestic violence and actually impacting people's lives. I think that's the way I look at it. I think over the long run, over the macro, I think it could generally be very, very effective. And to your point, the rates in there, for every pound that's put into these programs, it would appear that you're getting somewhere between £3 and £11 back in some sort of economic benefit. I was going to ask you a little bit more about that, but what I would assume that is people not going to prison, people not doing these other things, and the people still being able to go to work because they haven't suffered domestic violence, things of that nature. Are those the kind of economic benefits you're talking about?
Yeah, but also I think there are three types of benefits. I mean, you're saving the costs of crime prevention, right?
Yep.
You're saving the cost of to the judicial system, and then the cost to the victim. I mean, not being a victim of domestic abuse the impact is huge, because the way we would think about it is this would be the cost, I put it in quotation marks, cost saved of not being a victim, right? Because we know that domestic abuse is costly to the victim. It's costly in terms of mental health. It's costly in terms of their being able to maintain employment. It's costly in terms of a lot of other physical conditions. I mean, there are a lot of association studies that we've done showing that domestic abuse is associated with higher blood pressure, higher cardiovascular disease, higher incidences of diabetes, all-cause mortality. So, there's a huge impact of not being victimized.
Right.
There are also intergenerational effects.
Right.
So victims of domestic abuse, we find that there's a negative impact on the children. So again, that's a cost which is saved for the future generation. So these are the kind of cost savings that we are talking about. These are real, even though we monetize it, these are real costs of, people, improving the well-being of people. And I think that's really key to remembering how we understand or contextualize these costs.
Sure. And look, lawyers and barristers are expensive. Exactly. And so every time, the more criminal cases that go to court and the more cases that they have to deal with, that's more time and resources. Exactly. Every single time a domestic violence case and they have to go to the doctors, nurses are expensive, the resources are expensive. There's a lot of, I think you can say this in a lot of cases with government policy, but I would say it was particularly in this case, there are a lot of ancillary effects that by just trying to reduce the rates that you could essentially save and use that money for reinvestment in sort of the economy, particularly in a time as well when, there's a cost crunch essentially going on, people's standard of livings are dropping because of inflation and whatnot. I think being able to save those values at this kind of point in time is actually very important, because every sort of that pound for reinvestment in whatever that might be is very important, I would say.
Yeah, including healthcare, right? Yeah. So I mean, already the healthcare system is clogged up. So if as a result, there are less people who suffer from health conditions, I think that's great, not just for them,
absolutely,
but also has an external effect on other people being treated earlier. So I think the impact is actually huge. And there is a huge impact of criminal activities on the health sector. Yeah. We call it the public health burden of crime.
Of course. I mean, because it's obviously not just domestic violence cases. Crime obviously manifests itself in things like knife crime and all sorts. And although total violent crimes has actually been decreasing since I think in 1983 we had about 2 million violent crimes in the UK, and in 2020 it's about 1.2 million. That is obviously a significant decrease. 1.2 million is still quite a lot of violent crimes. However, it's still a lot, and those are the violent crimes as well. Even with thefts, for example, in 1981 there were about 6 million total thefts. That increased and actually went upwards into 1995 and to about 11 million. But now in 2020 we're down to about 3 million. Now 2020 was obviously when the pandemic started, so there may be some sort of rebounding there, but the trend has overall been down. Nevertheless, those are still quite significant figures that do have a very substantial impact every time that someone's stabbed with a knife or anything like that. Or this thing is incredibly costly when you're talking about trauma units, paramedics, doctors, the whole infrastructure, ambulances. Yeah. Obviously, we're very fortunate not have to pay for ambulances in the UK, but if you go to somewhere like America, they're very, very apparent at the cost of an ambulance, thousands of dollars just to get it out, right? And so any sort of reduction that we can get further in that was going to be able to make it a lot easier for us to actually reinvest and actually be able to take care of, have more doctors, more staffing, and be able to have less waiting times, and I would say, and things like that.
Yeah, and I mean, we don't pay directly in terms of paying for ambulance, right? But we do as taxpayers. We do in terms of opportunity costs. We do in terms of increased waiting times for people who need ambulances. So there's no such thing as a free lunch.
No, exactly. There's no such thing as free lunch. We pay for it one way or another. It's just maybe because we don't directly see the cost on like a daily, but on an invoice, maybe we're probably not as attached to it. I'm sure there's some behavioral economic sides of that. Because the fact that we pay it in taxes, maybe we don't necessarily appreciate the benefit or like see the cost of the benefit potentially. I'm sure there's some behavioral economics. Or if there's not, I would actually quite like to see that. I think that'd be quite interesting. With regards to these schemes, how prevalent are they in the UK? So this is C.A.R.A, this is one example. Obviously, you mentioned of these. It's one type of these kind of schemes.
Intervention programs,
that are, like you say, very prominent in America. I think 44 states actually.
Yeah, 44 states
actually use these types of schemes. So very, very prevalent in America. So mostly across the 50 states over there. How prevalent are they in the UK though? So this is obviously one scheme. Are there other schemes being used? How successful are they? Is it quite prevalent?
So a couple of things. One, C.A.R.A itself is used by about, I think, 6 forces and 2 other forces have dispensation to use it for low-risk offenders. But some form of intervention is prevalent across almost all the police force. I would say all the police force areas in the UK.
Right.
What's not clear, and it would be really helpful to have a kind of better national sort of standards and benchmarking on this. There are so many programs, each sort of trying to do similar things, but we don't have a really good comparison of, I can't even rank and tell you what programs there are. Forget ranking. I can't even tell you what programs there are across the country. So I think that's a real gap, actually, if you like. It's not that police forces aren't using it. Mm-hmm. They are. But, is C.A.R.A more effective for these group of offenders, like in comparison to, say, I'm just making it up, say Brighter Futures, which was another program that we evaluated a number of years ago, versus, longer programs like the sort of Mirable Intervention and so on and so forth. Right. That's what we don't know. We don't really know what works better and for what group of offenders.
Is that a data issue then? Do we not have readily available information as to what schemes are being used where on what demographics of people?
So we have some, and again, that'll need some searching. Generally you can look at some of the main programs being run, but they're often run not necessarily by the police, by local authorities, and that varies with funding. So there's so much of variation there that, I think if you ask me to produce a list tomorrow, I don't think I would be able to do that. There's no national database which says you can go into local authority data and things like that and compile one, but there's no real national database which will tell you, West Midlands uses these 3, Hampshire uses these 2, I don't know, Southampton uses this. So that's the real gap in our understanding. The data is potentially there and can be constructed, but it's quite a huge task.
Yeah, because it's interesting to me that this wouldn't be, and maybe this is just my ignorance on the matter, why this wouldn't be as consolidated as maybe it is, because it sounds as though there's lots of different types of, there's loads of different types of programs really specific to different areas and operating across regions. I guess I'm kind of surprised that either the NHS or the policing forces in the UK is implementing the schemes don't just have one standard scheme that has like an overarching umbrella that has implementations across different police forces nationally. I guess one, why do you have a reason for why that is, and 2, is that deficiency or is it a benefit?
Okay, so one reason is that why we don't have a national database is that these decisions are made at the local level, which in some sense is fine because, what works for one group of population may not.
Right.
But that's not really how it's done, right? It's because, within a locality, somebody thinks, oh, let's try this, is a great idea, and they do it. And it's not just in domestic violence. I think generally learning across local authorities or across police force areas is one area where we haven't actually done very well. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one area where I think police, at least in particular, and to an extent local authorities, are really keen now to, I think, understand these gaps, because there's no mandatory requirement that there'll be a national database where you have to report success statistics of every intervention program that you run. Most police forces won't be able to tell you what intervention programs they've invested in. I don't mean just domestic violence. They might be able to tell you, okay, these are the 3 main ones we run in domestic violence, but they just won't even be able to catalog the, and that's, I think, a huge gap, right, and a huge inefficiency there. I'm all for localism. I'm not saying that you have to replicate everything nationally, but This is a huge gap.
Yeah, sure. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think obviously different areas in the UK are obviously different to others. I mean, to the point you were making earlier about why you think the study was representative in the sense that because the two areas you looked at were demographically, economically, culturally different to an extent, and so it had some competing data there. To that very same point, you do want there are going to be some nuances and stuff for local areas, whether that be on, for example, we're in Birmingham at the moment, that has a much higher Indian or Asian population to, let's say, Surrey, where I'm from, which is like a much more of a white, sort of white British populace. Also, age demographics come into that. Something's going to work for older generations of people compared to younger generations of people. And so there's definitely a good point there in terms of making things more specific. I guess what you're losing out on, though, is essentially an economies of scale. Having something centralized, having resources that are packaged under a particular banner, that are accessed for the different regions, that they can still take those pieces of information that would be provided at, I would say, a national level and tailor them, but just being able to use those resources in that manner, I think would be, a big benefit. And it also would give you much more information and data that you could then collate, research, okay, this is working in this region, this is working in this region, this is how we fix it. So I think maybe, and my understanding is that C.A.R.A is a program under the police local authorities, is that?
Well, the police don't run it. There's an independent NGO, the Hampton Trust, for example, in these which run it.
Right.
And that's fine. They could expand, or other providers could be trained.
Right.
I think the bigger question is, as you put it, why isn't there some kind of standardization in terms of, okay, we know that for this group of offenders, this is what works and this is what we're going to try and replicate. It doesn't rule out innovation when you don't want to try new things or experimentation, but just having the database. And there are some sort of moves. The National College of Policing, in their library, they do this what works thing, not just about violence in general. So I think you're very slowly moving in the direction where you can actually look up what evidence there is on interventions.
Right.
And start to build, but I think we are nowhere near where we should be.
Yeah, because it sounds...
And that's, by the way, true for America as well. You
interesting, right? So
I would, in America, it's in a way probably even more, right? Because they have so much of sort of autonomy in states, right?
Of course, yeah.
So clearly, it's a no-brainer that you will see this in America. So it's not that there are standard protocols that people, or national protocols that people would be following in America either.
It sounds as though these programs are not being run by the policing institutions. They're actually being run by either charities or trusts, if that's correct?
Yes, and I think that makes perfect sense because, the police are not trained in, for example, anger management classes, or if it's a drug and alcohol program and how to deal with that. So obviously the police would link up potential recipients. The police would say, well, I think you'll benefit from this program, and then refer. But I think it's a good thing that the police don't run it, because ultimately the police are not trained in either anger management or rehab and so on. So their job is to identify who might be suitable for this.
Right. Interesting. I'm a little unsure on that. I think it's interesting, maybe because you talk about the anger management things there, and even alcohol training and things like that. I think that would be very beneficial to policemen to understand those nuances and have those.
I think it would be beneficial for the police to know what works. But I think as a police officer, you'd have some idea of how to identify somebody who's intoxicated, or how to manage a high stress situation.
Yeah.
But I don't think a police is a council, nor do I think it's necessarily a good thing for them to become what's called omni-component. And people differ on that. And, people say, well, the 21st century police officers should be more omnicompetent. And that's a different debate altogether, who should run it better. But I think in general, charities who run it are trained in these things. And of course, we shouldn't take them at their word. That's why it's necessary to do these evaluations. But the ones which actually work, I think they're the best people to be running these programs.
Sure. I guess my only sort of counter to that would be if they're being run by charitable institutions and trusts, the funding consistency necessarily wouldn't be there. And maybe there's not a level of integration into the health service or the policing sector that you could maybe achieve if you did so. So to put this on the other side, is this something that should be run by as a branch of the National Health, for example, if it is having such impacts?
So a couple of things. I think this is generally true for anything run by police or local authorities. Funding varies, and I think even the way NHS is structured, even this general health history at the point of care, whereas some of these could be integrated. Yes, I take your point. Some of this could be integrated within the NHS, and a funding model could be created. But I still think you'll see these variations in funding.
Right.
But it's still an interesting question that, should there be more involvement with the sort of NHS system? You could argue that the NHS is already kind of overburdened. There are diseconomies of scale. It's a giant organization. So I'm not sure. I mean,
bureaucracy and things like that, but slowing up operations.
Having said that, there could be bureaucracy in these local organizations, but they could be a bit more agile. But I totally take your point around funding. I mean, there have been newer programs which have been found to be successful and then couldn't be continued because the council ran out of funding for the next year. But I think that's a bigger question than just, who should be running C.A.R.A or other battery intervention programs.
Sure. And I think so far in this conversation, I think we've been rather singing the praises of these battery intervention programs. I guess just to be sort of well-rounded and holistic is to really ask, what are the downsides? What are the negatives of these programs, if you believe there are any? Maybe in terms of their total effectiveness, or potentially even some other factors that maybe they aren't necessarily as effective as other measures.
So I think with any program, there are two things you want to check. One is, do they have any impact at all? Mm-hmm. I mean, this one, I would say, is pretty robust, that it has, at least for the areas we evaluated. But there are so many programs being run on trust saying, and without getting into details, because there are programs being run and funded in the country which have no evidence base.
Right.
So you're spending a lot of money on something, which might not work. But also, more importantly, which is what you pointed out, they could be causing harm. We don't know. Just because we have no evidence that C.A.R.A causes harm does not mean that we cannot have programs which actually have the opposite effect of what we expect. So, of course, this is and that's why good evaluation is so important.
Or even, in fact, if C.A.R.A would even have even these relative effects in different areas of the country with different demographics, ethnicities, cultures, and economic environments.
So one of the things about C.A.R.A is, when you actually look at the data, you're more likely to be sort of entered into the C.A.R.A program if you're white, if you're older.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So selection into the program is not random. So by that I mean that people who choose to attend C.A.R.A is not.
I see.
Random.
Right. Okay.
Right?
So it's not like it's being offered to only select people. It's being offered to a broad spectrum of people, but only. Okay.
So in principle, it should be offered, again, because in the data we can only check selection into the program. We don't know whether that's because people don't want to go or police officers are more likely to offer it to somebody. These are really interesting things, and this is something which, at least as economists, we take this kind of selection or, this kind of bias very seriously. Awesome. So, that's why we generally would like to see randomized controlled trials and things like that.
Yeah. But that is interesting as well. Like you say, I think just because there could be multiple reasons for that specific example of more of one ethnicity going instead, it could be that they are more likely to choose that program. It could also be that they may be being offered it more than other ethnicities and stuff, which I think would also then be an issue and stuff. So that actually kind of leads into my next question. What research would you like to see be done in the future to really sort of build upon the findings that we found here? One of which could be potentially looking at just what we spoke about there in terms of the intake into these programs and whether it is and the causes behind those. Is it because it's being offered to everyone and only some people are selecting it, or is it only being offered to other people? But not just in that example, like what other research would you like to see that would build upon this research?
Yeah, so I think selection into programs, I think that's absolutely both fascinating as an area of research, but also has real policy implications.
Yeah.
Because if programs are being unevenly offered in general, and that could be because of a number of reasons. It could be unconscious bias. It could be that there's a reluctance in certain areas to believe that this could work. Mm-hmm. So the resistance could be on both sides. And that's, why we need to sort of have more detailed, in-depth sort of local analysis of this, which would also combine some of sort of the theory of change mechanisms. So even though I mostly do quantitative work, there's no doubt that sometimes behind the data, if you want to drill down, you want to look at some case studies and interview people just to understand what the barriers are into the program.
Yeah, because that's the thing with data. It's fantastic, but there are, it maybe seems more certain than maybe it is, and I think to your point, having some case studies and information like that is very, very useful to go along with that data to really sort of give us a more sort of well-rounded picture, I think. I guess just to sort of wrap up our discussion, I think I'll leave you with a question of, we've talked a little bit there about maybe standardization by incorporating it into other entities, whether that be a positive or a negative, I think sort of remains to be seen. That being said, is there something or a piece of government policy that you think that could be implemented that would help in regards to this, that would help human development, and whether that be in crime or in terms of health, that would make a positive impact on the UK economy? That might be in relation to trusts or standardization. What are your thoughts on that?
So I think maybe got a slightly higher level. I mean, and that is very related to standardization. I mean, just as I think crime and justice interventions are on a journey, just as at one time evidence-based medicine was frowned upon, right? Mm-hmm. Doctors said, no, we know our experience. So I think, crime and justice issues are on this journey towards evidence-based policy making. So I think we'd like to see that this journey doesn't get interrupted, it gets, better, and like to move to where evidence-based medicine has come. So that would be my kind of hope for the criminal justice world.
I think that's a pretty reasonable hope at this point. Well, thank you very much for your time, Sid. I do appreciate it. Is there any research that you're working on at the moment that you would like to point listeners to? What other things are you working on at the moment?
Yeah, so very briefly, I mean, as I said, and this is sort of the journey towards evidence-based policy making. We know very little about youth crime, or rather we know something about youth crime in terms of description of what they do. We don't know really what works for young people, what sort of, moves them away from offending, violence. So, so some of the research that I'm doing looks at getting really good, what I would say gold standard evidence around what interventions work in diverting young people away from crime, through the use of randomized controlled trials funded, for example, by the Youth Endowment Fund. And I think it's a real journey, because this is not something that people who run the programs are used to. So it's quite a journey for them as well, because randomized controlled trials doesn't mean that we randomly offer things to people. It means between things which we think might work, we randomly allocate, because we don't know which is going to be better and which is going to be worse. And so I think that's what I'm really excited about, this kind of research that we are currently doing to randomized controlled trials on youth interventions. And it was really fascinating to see, do these interventions that we hope will work are in fact working, and can they therefore be scaled up?
Excellent. Well, that sounds really important. I think we'll be really value adding in terms of some research.
Yeah.
That's all we have time for today, everyone. Thank you very much for joining in. Like I said, link Sid's research will be in the description down below. Please go check that information out. But until the next episode, we'll see you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for watching this episode of the Marginal Babble podcast. If you've enjoyed this content, please consider liking and subscribing down below, as well as commenting any future topics you would like to see discussed. But until then, see you soon.